A very good afternoon. Dr. Mohammed Maliki bin Osman, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Singapore. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman, Institute of South Asian Studies in U.S., and Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies in U.S. Distinguished panelists, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, in short ISAS, at National University of Singapore, I welcome you to today's ISAS book launch and panel discussion titled, Does India Negotiate? It is my pleasure to invite ISAS Chairman, Ambassador Pillai, to deliver the opening remarks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this book launch. This is the second book launch that we have had in the last 2 weeks. And our people seem to be very prolific writers. Let me welcome you once again, especially our chief guest, Dr. Maliki, the three people on the panel that is going to discuss the book. Then, of course, the author himself. I think he has done a good job. He will see how well his peers think of his arguments, whether they hold water or not. But I'm sure they will vindicate him. Ladies and gentlemen, this book is a question. Does India negotiate? I think what it shows is that there is doubt. You ask a question whether it's either yes or no, so it has to be one of them. And the way it is worded looks like the general feeling is it is a no. India does not negotiate, and therefore you need to talk about it. Now, is that correct? I think the evidence that Karthik has assembled to show that India does negotiate, that will be proven later on. When you look at India's foreign relations and you look at what Singapore enjoyed, this was in regard to the Sika. Everyone thought Sika was dead in the water when the government changed. The Congress government fell and another government had taken over, and it was felt that this is going to be the end of Sika. But both sides persevered and Sika came into being. Now, if you look at, even at state level, in Karnataka, the same thing happened. Not for a trade agreement, but for an investment. A very, very large investment was going into Bangalore, to Karnataka. And at that point, the government changed. And actually what happened was Gowda, the new chief minister, went to, I think it was in Kolkata, that Mr. Goh Chok Tong was attending some CII meeting. He flew there to assure him that nothing has changed and all facilities and all perks or whatever you give to investors are still intact and you will get them. So please do not withdraw from the project. That was the message. This so impressed our founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, that at a meeting with the Pakistanis, I was there. I was Singapore's ambassador to Pakistan, and I was there. And he mentioned to them that this is a lesson we must all learn, because just because there's a change of government, you lose an investor. That's unforgivable. So he did that. So our Indian relations with Singapore seem to be contrary to the impression that Indians do not negotiate. But I think what Karthik has done, I think, in the book, and I'm not speaking for Karthik, but the little I've seen of the book, it does show that they are a rational nation that negotiates on the basis of what is good for their own country. Now, that could be misinterpreted to say that you take a very selfish view and therefore you do not want to negotiate. But that depends on. Karthik is a young man who has just joined us last few months, and he will be meeting 3 very formidable heavyweights. I'm not talking about the actual weights, that also goes into it, but they are scholars. First, you have Dr. Raja Mohan, our director. He's chairman of this panel. And then I have Kantilal Bajpai, who would be a speaker, a very good speaker, and my colleague, Amit Chandu Palit, who is an extremely hardworking and extremely knowledgeable person who has been with us for quite some time. So if Karthik can get over these 3 and get their support to say that yes, India is a negotiating country, is willing to negotiate. It does not do so at sometimes when it is not in their interests. But normally they are a country that would listen to reason and to this. Usually we also talk about RCEP. India took 7 years to negotiate RCEP. And at the end of the day, they eased themselves out. But now there's rumor that they may ease themselves back. But maybe the conditions won't be the same. And India may have to take in a few little, knocks on the way, but they may still be there. We need to stay and understand how it is going to work out. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is what is going to have. It will be fun and games with 4 intellectuals trying to say what is the right situation as far as India's foreign policy, India's foreign multilateral situation, and so on, that sort of thing. But before I stop, I just want to make a small appeal, and maybe I hope I do not embarrass my guest of honor, because I find that, when you do a launch, you pass a book to the author passes back to you, and you say it's launch. But nothing like getting a few words of wisdom from the person who passes the book. So I would like to appeal to Senior Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Maliki, to say a few words, either at the beginning, later. You can sit, have a cup of coffee, relax, and think, formulate your thoughts, and we will be very happy to hear to you. So that's a request I have. I'm bold enough to say this because it worked last week with another book launch. This was on rethinking on governance. And the book was being launched by Mr. Shanmugam. So I asked him first, when he got out of the car, whether he would speak. He said, no, I'm not prepared. But as he walked up here, his resistance to speaking became much less. And I was standing here, and he said, will it upset the routine that you are? I said, not at all. We are used to chaos. This is, that's why we study India, So we will be very happy to have the minister speak. And he spoke about 14, 15 minutes. So that was a fantastic speech, actually, off the cuff. So, ladies and gentlemen, we hope we will be blessed with one of those again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to now invite Dr. Karthik Nachiyappan, Research Fellow, ISAS, to introduce his book, Does India Negotiate? Dr. Karthik, please.
Senior Minister of State, Dr. Maliki bin Osman, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Professor Raja Mohan, Professor Kanti Bajpai, distinguished guests, excellencies, colleagues, friends, and family. I'm deeply humbled that Senior Minister of State, Dr. Maliki, is here to launch the book. Thank you. I'm deeply grateful to Professor Raja Mohan and Professor Kanti Bajpai and Dr. Palith for agreeing to be part of the panel discussion. I know most of you have not read the book, but it's somewhat daunting for the author at a book launch to have two people who are part of one of the chapters in the book to be part of the panel discussion here after. That's Kanti and Raja. Thank you. I'm thankful to the ISAS team for organizing the event today, and many friends and family here, including my mother and my wife, without whom the book would not exist. I'm also delighted that all of you are here on a rainy, stormy Monday afternoon for this event. Thank you. In December 2009, world leaders gathered in Copenhagen to negotiate and clinch a global climate agreement. Despite their efforts, the summit fizzled, with no meaningful pledges to reduce carbon emissions. The blame for the summit's failure was not equally shared. Some countries bore the brunt of the criticism. India led the way here. Scholars and commentators alike lambasted India for sacrificing the future generations for short-term gains. The criticism leveled at India, however, was not new. India's multilateral positions and stances have aroused the ire of many Western observers who have consistently admonished India for not commensurately contributing to help address global problems like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and protectionism. Scholars have generally reinforced these views, claiming that India is a prickly, defensive, multilateral stakeholder, more interested in obstructing multilateral efforts than contributing to them. The prevailing discourse on Indian multilateralism largely echoes these views, arguing that India's behavior is more often than not characterized by indignation, self-righteousness, and resistance. Such claims, I argue, conceal and obfuscate more than they reveal. The problem with such explanations and claims is twofold. First, how does India's so-called defensiveness actually affect policy outcomes, that is, signing and ratifying a particular international agreement or not? Now, if you're defensive and obstructionist and regularly stymie negotiations, then you probably will not sign many negotiations and international rules thereafter. But that is not the case for India. Since the 1980s, India has signed and ratified more agreements than it has rejected. And second, these judgments concerning India's multilateral behavior have been made without sufficiently unpacking the actual negotiations themselves. The empirical grounds underpinning such claims are conspicuously weak. There was a clear need to unpack India's positions at multilateral negotiations before and as they unfolded. The book argues that India's multilateral behavior, at least since the 1980s, has been rational, sober, driven by interests, both security and economic, and not overly influenced by considerations related to identity, ideology, victimhood, or culture. Instead, the book posits that we need to unpack the political economy around India's multilateral approach and positions. That is, how domestic interests are shaped, how institutions respond given these interests, and the knowledge of the issue being negotiated, and how interest groups work with government institutions to further their own interests vis-a-vis these set of negotiations. Now, why does political economy matter? Since the 1980s, the broader international context around which India negotiates international rules, and arguably its foreign policy, has fundamentally changed. It is now characterized by interdependence that has not only embedded India within the international economy, but has generated convergence in a growing number of policy areas within the international order. Interdependence has left India little choice but engage on multilateral issues that affect its development and security. More importantly, interdependence has and still shapes the interests of actors, both state and non-state, who then attempt to influence how India negotiates multilateral issues and whether they ratify a particular agreement or not. So, institutional capacity and interest group advocacy, I argue, drives and constrains India's negotiating strategy and positions at multilateral negotiations and directly affects whether India signs a particular international rule or not. And this conceptual argument is borne out through the 4 cases that are featured in the book: the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the Uruguay Round Trade Agreement. In 3 of these cases, tobacco control, climate change, and trade, India was a rule shaper, negotiating robustly to ensure provisions in the final agreement reflected their interests, which also resulted in India's ratification once negotiations were complete. On tobacco control, Indian negotiators sought to produce an agreement that would constrain tobacco sales and commerce domestically, just as the costs, both health costs and human costs, from tobacco use rose sharply at home. On climate change, Indian officials worked hard to entrench an alternate understanding of climate change within the United Nations remit that hinged not on a collective responsibility to reduce carbon emissions, but a differentiated responsibility given historic contributions to global warming over the decades. India's efforts with respect to CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities, helped foreground equity within international climate politics that still lingers to date. And on trade, the Uruguay Round trade negotiations from 1994 to 2002 served as an opportunity for Indian trade negotiators to generate and secure additional foreign market access for Indian goods and services. As India liberalized in the 1980s, firms in textiles, agriculture, and services wanted more foreign market access for their exports, which then influenced the positions and concessions made by Indian negotiators at the trade round. Conceptually, India's approach towards international rules and whether it signs a rule or not depends on 2 factors: institutional capacity within the state and interest group advocacy. First, institutional capacity matters. For India to be a rule shaper, Indian negotiators generally have a strong understanding of the problem being negotiated and how it affected India, and adopt positions to address or ameliorate that problem. When institutional capacity is strong, negotiations either serve as opportunities. Rulemaking then allows bureaucrats at home to tackle existing policy problems. For example, rising tobacco use or inadequate market access. The negotiators then leverage multilateral negotiations to craft and justify new policies to help address that problem at home. Or negotiations become constraints, as in the case of climate change and nuclear disarmament, which led to rearguard measures to prevent the rule from altering the domestic status quo at home. If resistance works and India is able to limit their exposure to the international agreement, we should and could expect ratification thereafter. But when resistance is unsuccessful and India is unable to secure its interests, the only option left is abstention or rejection, which was what happened after the negotiations for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And second, interest groups have a clear say and influence over India's negotiating strategy. Civil society groups, NGOs, business lobbies, environmental research organizations help Indian negotiators before and during negotiations, boosting their knowledge on the issue being negotiated to clear the road for India's eventual accession to the agreement. On tobacco control, trade, and climate change, interest groups functioned as knowledge agents, filling critical gaps concerning specific provisions in the agreement and how they affected India before and during negotiations. To be sure, not all interest groups had an equal say or space to articulate their views, but we can clearly map the role and influence of certain groups on India's positions, given their own specific interests vis-a-vis the rule being negotiated. By investigating how India negotiates international rules, focusing on these 4 issues, the book essentially shows that India is not a recalcitrant negotiator or naysayer when it comes to multilateral issues, refusing to pull its weight and share burdens of global governance. In fact, when rules reflect and advance India's interests, there has been a clear desire to shape, sign, and ratify agreements, not the other way around. Defensiveness, the perennial claim against India in the multilateral domain, must be placed in the context since all countries rarely enter multilateral negotiations looking to concede, not gain. So does India. Why then is India regarded as a defensive, prickly, multilateral actor? First, because the standards and benchmarks that are used to measure and assess the behavior of rising powers like India when it comes to global governance have been myopic, selective, and largely self-serving. Measuring and assessing India's multilateral behavior against an external standard, either accession or proactive participation, is fundamentally flawed since it does not adequately engage with or unpack the politics around how multilateral issues manifest domestically at home. And second, Western powers routinely resort to othering as a strategy to maintain their primacy, compelling other rising powers like India to conform to their preferred rules, only to brand them as either veto players or violators of certain norms and principles when they resist or defy. Yet, these industrialized countries, especially the United States, seldom subject themselves to the same standards that they impose on others, even as they pick and choose how they behave when it comes to addressing global challenges. The negotiations in this book reveal a United States that acts as any other state, aware of its core interests, insistent and firm in pursuing them, and not bound by any larger global public goods concerns when their core interests are undermined. When negotiations conflicted with overriding US interests, American officials consistently rebuffed commitments since the 1980s. Yet it largely falls on rising powers like India to generally step up when it comes to helping address global governance challenges like climate change and nuclear proliferation. Why? To date, little effort has been given to carefully probe how and why countries, rising powers like India, behave as they negotiate a challenging international order that was designed after World War II by fiat to reflect the interests and principles of advanced industrialized countries and economies. This book shows that India, when interests align, India is willing to shape rules, cut deals, make compromises, and resist challenges when it comes to international rulemaking. Simply put, India does negotiate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karthik. Next is the launch of the publication, Does India Negotiate?, authored by Dr. Karthik. It gives me great pleasure to invite our distinguished guest of honor, Senior Minister of State, Dr. Maliki, Ambassador Pillai, and Professor Mohan to join Dr. Karthik on stage for the launch of the publication. Dr. Maliki will unveil the book to signify the launch of the publication, Does India Negotiate? Dr. Karthik will now present a copy of his book to Dr. Maliki.
I get one free.
So we will now take the group photo. Thank you, Dr. Maliki. We have come to the end of the first part.
Yes. Ministers agreed to say a few words.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can announce.
Yeah. Our minister will say a few words. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can't say no to Professor Ambassador Pillai after what he said already. First of all, good afternoon, Ambassador Pillai, Professor Raja Mohan, as well as our author of the day, Professor Karthik. Sorry, I missed your name. Karthik Nachiappan. My heartiest congratulations to Professor Nachiappan for this publication and the launch of today's book. As mentioned by Ambassador Pillai, I didn't come prepared with a speech, but I'm just going to say a few words in relation to how important the book is to all of us. There's much that's been said about India and Singapore's relation with India for many years. In fact, last year we commemorated our bicentennial, and many Singaporeans had not realized the strong relation and the origins that Singapore had for the last 200 years with regards to our relation with India. And for many years, we've seen how important India has been to Singapore in all fronts, whether it's in trade, whether it's in foreign relations, and even in defense. And with the defense ministry, we have very strong defense relations with India. In relation to what's happening around the world today, we know how critical this book is. In the context of multilateral negotiations, the context of multilateral trade, much has been said about how we must, in Singapore particularly, uphold this whole principle of multilateral system, and being an open economy, we cannot do without such a principled position. I'm very glad that the book, we've not read the book yet, but I think it will, as described by Karthik earlier, discuss examples of how India has been seen to be willing and has already been negotiating. I think the question is not whether does India negotiate, but really how will India negotiate in different contexts, and how should we negotiate with India? That's a critical thing. I've been asked many times why a social worker like myself end up in the foreign ministry as well as in the defense ministry. And I think one of the critical things that I've learned from my own background is that when you talk about negotiation, it's really the importance of understanding who you're negotiating with. You need to know who you're negotiating with in order for you to be able to negotiate well. If you don't know the person, you don't know who you're negotiating with, then you'll never get to an end point. You never get to a point where you can agree with one another. So I think the question is really, how do we negotiate with India? And how much do we know about India for us to be able to negotiate to a point that we can all agree to a certain landing point? And I think that's what I hope the discussion will bring us to. And in Singapore, we want to continue to learn more about how best we can work with India as an important partner honor, not just for Singapore, but also for the region. There's much for Singaporeans to learn also. There's much about India that many Singaporeans still don't understand. For example, we hear so much about Sika. Ambassador talked about Sika. We see Sika positively, but some people see Sika quite not positively. But it can't be that we have negotiated something which is not of our interest in Singapore either. So there must be something that we have to continue to look at. And one of the things I've learned over the years also in politics is that all politics is local, right? And we must also appreciate that in India. And Indian politics is very complex. And when you talk about negotiating with a big country like India, it's really to understand what the politics is like. And if you don't understand that, and you will have a hard time trying to understand, what do I do with you? How do I go about discussing things with a country like India? So I hope this book will give us some insights into how best we can take things forward as far as Singapore is concerned, how best we can work with a very important partner like India, which is important, as we know, not just for the region, but also for the world, and how Singapore can benefit in this context. I hope the discussion will bring us to greater insights into understanding what we can do, and of course, guide us in our work too, in working with India. My apologies, I have to run off to another engagement, but I wish everyone the very best in the discussion, and my heartiest congratulations to Hartik again for this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for your insightful reflections. We have come to the end of the first part of today's event. Next is the panel discussion on the book, Does India Negotiate? The session is chaired by Professor Mohan. Please allow us a few minutes to set the stage for the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the panel discussion titled, Does India Negotiate? The distinguished panelists on stage for the discussion are Professor C. Raja Mohan, Director of ISAS, Professor Kanti Bajpai, Director, Center on Asia and Globalization, and Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in U.S., Dr. Amitindu Paulit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economic Policy, ISAS, and Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow, ISAS. The panel is chaired by Professor Mohan. I shall now hand over the session to Professor Mohan.
Thank you, John, and let me welcome you all for this book launch. I think we've heard from Karthik about the book. India does negotiate. The question is how, and I think that is the larger question, I think, that's going to come out of this work. So just let me say 3 preliminary points, and then I'll leave it to our 2 discussants. One, I think I really want to commend this book because there is not enough written on the nature of India's multilateralism. How does India negotiate on the international treaties and conventions, and the perceptions, certainly those that have gained ground in the 90s, have added to the image of India as a prickly, difficult negotiator. So I think by unpacking, as Karthik has said, he's opened up some work, some space for, I think, work on actually how does really India go about negotiating international agreements. And I hope that this is really the beginning of something that we see more people would follow through. The second point, I think, is, as Karthik said, look, it's about defining interests. Of course, how India defines those interests has changed over a period of time. There was a period in the 1950s when India was at the forefront of negotiating nuclear agreements, essentially calling for universalist solutions. And by the 90s, of course, India was opposing the main agreements, whether it was the CTBT, whether it was later the nuclear deal with the Americans. So there is how India saw the issue change over a period of time. So it's not a yes or no over a single period, but there is over time, the context, a lot depends on that. So therefore, the studying over a period of time, how India has negotiated different things, I would say makes a lot of sense. And I think this is the beginning of that work. The second aspect is on the internal element, that most international negotiations also reflect a domestic negotiation between different groups. That's always far more daunting, and that winning the internal negotiation between different competing groups is as hard as actually negotiating with external partners. And my own sense is in the 90s, as India changed course from an inward economy where it was under pressure to open up, how it ought to negotiate with the new global arrangements on trade were contested internally. So therefore, negotiation externally became complicated. Similarly, on the nuclear question, whether India should keep its option open, whether it should exercise the option, were deeply contested issues within the Indian establishment. Therefore, the negotiation automatically became a lot more difficult. So I think looking at over a period of time and space, issue by issue, opens up a lot more possibilities. The third thing I wanted to say at the beginning was really some of these problems endure. For example, RCEP, of course, many in the region would want to know why India is not done. Later at the Osaka summit most recently, India stayed out of the final declaration on the data governance on data. So these are important issues. So I think we need to continue this work of what are the forces, ideas, internal difficulties that animate India, whether India's opposition to regional trade agreement or whether it is on the data governance, that these are need to be pursued. And I think Karthik's work opens up a path for further research. And I hope as ISAS, where we are mandated to look at contemporary South Asia, we'll be able to get more work done on these issues which clarify, which explicate India's negotiating positions on the international stage. So I'll stop here, and I'll now invite Professor Kanti Bajpai to make his intervention. Yeah.
Raja, thanks very much. And of course, thanks to Karthik for giving me this chance to, well, first of all, to read the book, which I've been aware of for quite a long time, but also to come here and comment on it. So my starting point is, I think Karthik's done a lovely job of, of summarizing the main arguments of the book and the focus of the book. What I thought I'd begin by doing is trying to go back to something that the ambassador said and Raj has said as well, which is just situate the book in work that has been done, and there's not a lot of it on India's multilateral behavior. And I think we can distinguish at least kind of 3 points or perspectives that exist to see where Karthik really comes down. The first is a kind of cosmopolitan Nehruvian position on Indian multilateralism. So this was the view, and is the view, that India is actually a wonderful multilateralist, deep in its DNA from Nehru onwards, if not earlier. It's been a kind of universalist in its instinct, that it wants to push international agreements, that it backs international institutions, that it's a very positive force for those kinds of agreements. And if you read, a lot of Indian diplomats take Jagat Mehta, former foreign secretary's book called Negotiating for India. All his accounts of the various negotiations emphasize this kind of international good citizen that India is. Iti Abraham is in this room. He and in his work recently on the issue of refugees has pointed out that India, amongst other countries from the global south, was very much present at the creation of international refugee law and the norms surrounding it. That it was not apart from it, and it was deeply embedded in those ideas. Manu Bhagavan of NYU, which work Karthik refers to, has made the point that, contrary to the general view, right at the start of the negotiations on human rights in the UN, India was a force for a universalist declaration on human rights, an aggressive proponent of a universalist declaration. That it may have become more defensive later is a different matter, but I think the first perspective on India is that India is a negotiating power, and that it always stood for universalistic, multilateral institutions going back to perhaps what Raj describes as its first phase. On the other side, if I might quote or bring to light a book that takes kind of almost the opposite view, and I guess dramatizes the naysayer kind of view of India, is Amrita Narlekar's book, who incidentally is a former student of mine, but anyway, Amrita, in a book that draws on the Mahabharata and the norms and traditions that are embedded in that, shows that there's a very deep structure in India of being kind of rejectionist, or being very rigorous, let's say, in negotiation, almost difficult in negotiation. So she attributes this to what you might call India's political culture, even its culture, at least Hindu classical culture, going a long way back, to show that India, even in contemporary India, India is difficult to deal with, and focuses on what she calls distributionism, on trying to make sure that weaker countries like India, the global south, gets a good deal, and if it doesn't get a good deal, it just walks away. So there's a middle ground, and I think Karthik is part of that middle ground, along with 2 or 3 other works that do exist. I mean, there's very little work. Raj was involved in putting together a big book on Indian foreign policy, a handbook, and there are several essays there that I think show that India is a tough negotiator but does negotiate. W.P.S. Sidhu, Pratap Mehta, and Bruce Jones have an edited book on how India shapes the emerging world. I think that occupies this middle ground. David Malone, the Canadian diplomat, has kind of straddled that, although he's a bit more cautious about how easy it is to work with India. And I'm thinking of also the American diplomats Stacey Schaefer and Howard Schaefer's book on India at the High Table, which show that at least the new India, Raj has talked about the sort of 4th phase of Indian multilateral negotiation, they point to India being much more practical, user-friendly as India rises to power. So I think between the extremes of kind of the Indian diplomatic establishment of the early generations like Jagat Mehta and the extreme naysayers typified by someone like Amrita Narlekar's account, I think these people occupy the middle, and I think Karthik, for me, occupies that middle ground. India as not so much a rule taker necessarily, not so much as a rule breaker, but a rule shaper, even if it's a toughie in getting there. The second broad point, I think, is that India, well, from the book, I would say that there are kind of 6 important contributions that we ought to pay attention to, and I think Raj has alerted us to some of them. The first is, and I think the ambassador did too, the first is that Karthik insists that one can produce a rationalist account of India's negotiation behavior. That you don't have to fall into either some kind of Kantian internationalism, some celebration of India as an international good citizen that relentlessly just seeks to demonstrate that, nor do you have to fall into some kind of argument about identity. That there's some deep structures of norms and ways that India has that it just can't get away from. It's a reflex that colors everything that India does. So I think it's rather important to hold to this middle ground, even though I, in my own work, I suppose over the last 8 or 10 years, have insisted on kind of focusing on India's kind of strategic culture and the deeply rooted nature of some of Indian decision-making. But I think it's rather refreshing to me to encounter a robust defense of a rationalist account of Indian foreign policy. I think a second big contribution is that these are 4 very solid accounts of these negotiations within a structured framework. So it's not a hugely theoretical work driven by some very strong propositions that lead you to into these case studies, but asking a similar set of questions. Karthik very nicely allows the story to be told in a structured way, to be sure, but in a very comparative way across the four cases. And I think It's a kind of model of how you can do this kind of comparative work across issue areas. In fact, the framework would lend itself to any country's cases. The third contribution is the kind of range of sources that have been used here. And I was quite struck by the fact that Karthik has gone to archival sources, to oral histories, to interviews with people who are practitioners and were present at the creation of these rules and in these negotiations. He's looked at newspaper accounts, expert accounts, speeches and statements, and so on. We might think that this is what everyone does, but it's not what everyone does. And I think particularly reaching back to archival material and taking the trouble to go back to diplomats and others who were involved in the negotiations is extremely hard to do, and I think it's a particular strength of the book. The fourth great contribution is one that I alluded to, which is it gets us away from several other kinds of approaches to Indian foreign policy. I alluded to some of my own preferences towards trying to unpack India's strategic and diplomatic culture as an explanation of why India does what it does. But I think Karthik has steered away from that. Nor is this book quite the contemporary history movement in Indian foreign policy. I think I would point at ITI as kind of a leader of that group, but I'm thinking here of Srinath Raghavan, Rudra Chaudhary, Manu Bhagavan, Pallavi Raghavan, and others who've really gone to the archive to look at the early period of Indian foreign policy in particular, and they've stayed away from very contemporary issues, unlike Karthik. So I think that's, nor is this a memoir-based book. It's not the former foreign secretaries, negotiators, and others coming to the fore. It's a deeply empirical work, and I think that's a fantastic strength of it, as Raj pointed out. 5, and I'll just finish very quickly, it's ambitious. I don't know of any other book, at least in recent memory, that has spanned 4 such very different issue areas and is written with such competence and clarity. I mean, frankly, I can't see myself being able to unpack India's policy on trade, tobacco control, nuclear weapons, and climate change. I mean, you would think that we need 4 different authors to do it. Karthik has managed to do this in 4 different spheres with great, kind of convincingness. Finally, I think, and this is my third and last point, the book pushes us to think about a bunch of questions, one of which has been articulated already. Why did India opt out of RCEP? What's the story that Karthik can tell us about, with the pieces he assembles of domestic interest groups, institutional kind of drivers in the bureaucracy, and kind of the logic of interdependence that produced, in this case, trying to shape and then walking away. Second, how will India negotiate trade deals in the future that are bilateral and regional? Do the same dynamics that kick in to shape India's role in multilateral settings operate also in bilateral and regional? And I say this because it seems like with the Americans and perhaps even the Europeans stepping away from multilateralism so much, the future looks like a lot of bilateral and regional deals. Thirdly, somebody mentioned, I think Raj mentioned the issue of internet and that whole agenda. I think that's ripe for Karthik's intervention, and what do you think there? And I think finally, I mean, you mentioned it very briefly, but the one alternative explanation which I think's there, but which others have made much more strongly, which you may not agree with altogether, which is the really determining factors sometimes for India is its kind of bureaucratic or institutional capacity. Much has been made of how thin the foreign service is in terms of its numbers, and that there's a lack of expertise on very technical issues in other ministries, and that this leads typically, not just India, but other countries to stall in negotiations. When you don't have the requisite institutional expertise and capacity, it's a good idea to stall while you get your act together, and sometimes this leads to India being a kind of resistor, perhaps more so than it might otherwise have been. So I wonder how much Karthik would place emphasis on that. I like the book very much, obviously, especially for its deeply empirical unpacking of these cases, which I think really for foreigners who encounter India, but even for Indians, I mean, I think it's a handbook that every Indian diplomat and anyone who engages India ought to have. We've got the Indian Deputy High Commissioner here. I don't know if he's read the book, but I highly recommend it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanti. Amitin?
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan, and let me begin by congratulating Karthik on accomplishing a very major challenge, which I would say, firstly, because of the fact that this is a subject which has not been dealt with as much rigor and details as it requires, and secondly, for the very commendable multidisciplinary comparative perspective that Karthik has taken in analyzing the puzzles that he sets out in the book. I'll confine my comments to the trade issue, and that too more from a multilateral framework perspective, which Karthik brings in here. Now, from a very sort of somewhat superficial external perspective, people who look back at India's trade engagement would tend to argue that India's trade negotiations, in terms of the depth by which it is engaged in multilateral negotiations, appears to have come a full circle. During the 60s, 70s, and for a considerable part of time into the 80s, India was hardly a part of any of the global narratives that contributed to shaping of global trade till it joined the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, leading to the establishment of the WTO, one of the case studies that Karthik looks at intensely in the book. And then beginning from that time, India's contribution to various trade narratives at the WTO were quite substantial. It's a different matter that India did have positions which were very different from various clubs and blocs within the multilateral group, but till about the 2008, India had a very active role to play at the WTO in various forums, but something changed fundamentally from 2008. And if from 2008 one turns up to today, then one might just get the somewhat sketchy impression that India has actually gone back to the position that it used to took in the 70s and 80s, which is more of a disengagement, which is more of an isolationist position. How much of truth is there in that? Now, let me point to one particular instance, and I think Professor Rajamohan alluded to the fact that India is often considered as a prickly negotiator. Why does that image hold? I think that's primarily because of the fact that, at least when it comes to trade, negotiations sometimes are not very different from bargaining. I think it often comes down to that, one-on-one bargaining. Like, say, for example, 2008 June, negotiations at WTO had almost reached a convergence on the way forward on the Doha development agenda between India and China on one hand and the US and the European Union on the other hand, but they got stuck at one point. That is the value of the imports, which would induce an automatic safeguard trigger from the point of view of the affected countries. And these four countries between them could not arrive at a common number, a baseline increase over the volume of imports, which would trigger that automatic safeguard measure. So it was a question of bargaining eventually, hardly negotiations, because there could be relative positions on how much about an increase from the baseline import should trigger an automatic safeguard. But once those talks collapsed, the whole scenario on global trade changed, and particularly when 4 months later, global financial crisis broke, and then thereafter, over the next 10 to 12 years, something fundamentally has changed with global trade, and the biggest one of those changes is the fact that the multilateral rules-based order that has governed trade has itself come under a lot of criticism. Now, that has influenced many of the countries' participation in WTO and multilateral trade negotiations. What we increasingly see, and this is where I think there are a couple of observations that Karthik makes in his book which are extremely valid. There's a great amount of trade and advancement in trade conversations which have started taking place either parallel to the WTO or outside of the WTO. And in most of these, India is playing an ununiform role. It is contributing to some. In others, it is either staying away or contributing in a very selective fashion. Now, again, by and large, the question of perception has come from the way India has been engaging in these negotiations outside of the WTO, as an example, the RCEP. There is actually very little reflection on what is the role that India is playing within the WTO at this point in time. Let's say, for example, on the fisheries subsidies. What is the role that India has been playing in that? What was India's role in bringing to an end the trade facilitation agreement? Much of those have actually got sided over the fact that when it comes to prominent negotiations which capture greater space in the media, like say for example in the mega free trade agreements and so on and so forth, India's presence has been noticeable in a disturbing sense. And that disturbing sense is mostly because of the fact that India has been uncomfortable, India has been hesitant to take part in this, largely because from a trade perspective, India is essentially a multilateral player. That's where India's engagement has been most robust. And that's where India has got used to contributing to an agenda which is very multilateral focused and which is essentially focused on a limited sense, because the WTO's role insofar as the global trade has been concerned in terms of achievement has been by and large basic and limited on market access in agriculture, in some elements of non-agricultural space, but beyond that, when it comes to the new elements of trade, for example, e-commerce, data, competition policy, government procurement, matters which really engage the preoccupation of a large number of trading nations in the world, are actually not the subjects on which India has communicated. And this is also a reflection of the fact that India probably is not very comfortable in contributing to these subjects, and which again brings us back to the question that does India have adequate institutional capacities for contributing to these subjects? Probably not. It is only probably much later, or not even today, that a realization has come over the fact that is it really worthwhile fighting so hard over tariffs? If one takes a look at the basic question that who do the tariffs influence? It influences manufacturing in India, and manufacturing contributes only 17% of the Indian GDP. What contributes to the most of the Indian economy is the services, which is 55 to 57%. Tariffs are not important for that segment, but rest of the elements of global trade and external commerce are, but then how? How and in what way? That is where the conversation within India still continues to remain insufficient. And that is where probably there is a certain degree of discomfort as far as India is concerned when it comes to its preparedness to contribute to these issues. And it also realizes the fact that any kind of commitment might have implications for a state of play within an economy where the institutions are not prepared to handle the degree of convergence which a commitment from India's side might produce for the rest of the economy. One of the biggest examples is e-commerce. There's a great degree of hesitation over e-commerce. There's a great degree of hesitation over investment rules. There's a great degree of hesitation over the data template that India should have, simply because there is uncertainty over what the implications might be insofar as an Indian economy, which is still imperfect in a large number of respects, is concerned. Now, from here then, I would address the fundamental question that Karthik poses in this book: does India negotiate? I would say when it comes to trade, and again I confine myself to a multilateral setting, I would say no, because it is not sure of what to negotiate. And this, in a sense, is probably producing a degree of abstention on part of India, which again I don't think is permanent, which again I think is simply a reflection of the fact that there's a great degree of internal conversation going on between different groups in terms of what might be the right approach, in terms of whether to first get the domestic institutions and domestic regulations prepared for contributing to a committed agenda at the multilateral level or outside of the multilateral level, before actually taking a call on yes, we should go ahead or not. And it is only then, after that degree of preparedness has been achieved, that India can actually get into negotiation. I think that is a view which is increasingly gaining currency, and till that point in time, it is better to stay away. Now, the risk in this view is that, contrary to what Karthik argues in the various cases that he has examined, that India had the opportunity of playing a rule shaper. Staying away means the rules have to be taken as the way they come. So that is a risk which is being run, but it could be a calculated risk, it could be a deliberate risk, it could be a well-assessed risk in the medium term in certain respects. The other big problem, I think, which India now has, at least at the multilateral level when it comes to trade, is that earlier, during the Doha Development Agenda shaping and so on and so forth, India had a much more homogeneous group of countries coming onto the turf with it on similar issues. Today, that same group of countries, the G77 group of countries, the developing market group of countries, have cracked. Between them, the agendas are very different. India and Indonesia can work together in resisting the Osaka track on data development, but they fight with each other when it comes to fisheries subsidies. So I think it needs to be appreciated that today we exist in a world when the entire issue and rule of space that multilateralism in trade had offered is itself undergoing a lot of challenges. And given that assumption, given that state of flux, the way India negotiates in multilateral trade issues in future is going to be something which is really going to be very interesting to look at. Perhaps it might require a new paradigm, and perhaps Karthik again would want to revisit this issue, maybe 5 years down the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.